Hey, I'm Veronica from UXPressia. Let me briefly introduce you to what we at UXPressia do. UXPressia is an online platform where you can build customer journey maps, impact maps, and personas for your organization. With more than 100 ready-to-use templates, you can speed up your persona creation and mapping processes. To help you build confidence on your journey and learn from other practitioners, we host community events on user, customer, employee experience, and all things journey mapping. Our speakers are industry experts that are willing to share their knowledge to help you design and build better products and services. We also speak at the events ourselves and share tips and tricks we learned through years of practice and numerous interviews with other mappers. On top of that, we have UXPressia Academy, where you can dive into learning how to build journey maps, personas, and conduct interviews. And do that all at your own pace. Don't forget to check it out and enjoy the event.
Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join today, and I'm hoping you all get an engaging experience out of this. My goal is to share a little bit about some of the best practices I have found as I've been working with journey maps for my career, and then go from there. But as Veronica said, hope to hear more from you in the chat, or we can have some conversations after this. And thanks, Veronica, for the presentation. I am, been doing journey maps for almost 20 years now. My first journey map was in Latin America in Spanish, so it was a different experience altogether. But I have been using UXPressia since it was in beta form, so I have a lot of experience and have helped contribute some of the features on there. I'm also a part of our CX Accelerator community. It's a great community if you're a CX professional, either getting started or not, to get connected. So I'm one of the conversation leaders in the channels there, but feel free to check that out. And we will be sharing these slides afterwards, so don't feel like you have to take vigorous notes afterwards. So the other thing we'll be going over today is so key takeaways, what I'm hoping you get out of this today. I will kind of go over really high level. You might know what a journey map is, but I always like to really start with the basics, and then we get into a little bit more of, okay, let's talk about how to prioritize, how do we choose the metrics. And then I will be showing it's a older map, and I've had to take out any of the client references or anything, but we will be going into a journey map and kind of show you how to bring it to life within UXPressia, and really show you kind of an approach that you might not always use when you're doing journeys. So we'll talk through that a little bit more. So quick overview of journey maps. I always like to mention that, remember that journey maps are, they're a tool. They're a communication tool, right? They're really helping us visualize and do that storytelling. As Veronica mentioned, I have that background in storytelling. So it's my passion to make sure that the maps are something that you can communicate. And so while sometimes there's a tendency to put a little too much detail in, you want to make sure you're really creating this map for an audience that's not just you and just the team putting it together. It really needs to be a map that communicates to others. And so as you think about that, make sure you're building your tool there. The other thing I always like to point out is whenever I talk to somebody in the business or some client and says, hey, I want a journey map, they have no idea of all the different efforts that need to happen even before that, right? The journey map is just the surface of what we're really talking about. So if you've been doing journey maps for a while, and if you haven't, just FYI, there's a lot more too that goes into planning to the journey map before you're just in the tool and building the journey or facilitating a workshop. So I think it's really important for people to use that, and feel free to make sure you use this in your communications. And then the other key part about journeys is a lot of times I've seen them kind of get a little unfocused when they're not focused on one persona with one scenario to tell a clear story. If we're talking about people in general or segments of people in general, the journeys can get a little bit lost, and then your visual communication tool starts to break down, right? So making sure the journeys have a focus and an objective. And again, when I show you our journey that we worked on, and that I've worked on with clients in the past, like you'll see that it's very focused on one specific scenario to tell a clear story of what's going on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I always like to also share just a little bit of like, from my experience of working with journeys throughout my career, I've seen a lot of this, of where these things of why journeys fail, like having that wrong perspective or leaving out the detractor. I've seen some people try to map out a journey and there's never a problem. And then it's like, well, wait, why did we choose a journey that doesn't even have an issue involved? Things like that. So like making sure that you don't fall into these traps of having a journey that fails is part of the prioritization. And we'll talk more about that prioritization as well. So here we are into the prioritizing journeys, like what's the way to do this? And one of the best practices, and Forrester's recently come out with a lot of research around this as well. But one of the best practices when you're thinking about journey maps and how to approach your journeys, you really should think about your customer lifecycle and your journey portfolio. It's really, you don't have to map every single one of these things, but you could try to say, okay, what are some key journeys that may happen in the awareness phase, for example, or the consideration phase? And I use this as a generic kind of approach, but really it's about thinking about what are all the different types of journeys or key journeys that could happen along the way that impact the business or have an impact to operations. Thinking about that, but try to think it holistically, right? Thinking about that end to end, what are the key journeys that a customer might take along the way, and really have an idea and sense of your portfolio. If you just start with one or two journeys, that's okay. But from a strategy perspective, you really want to take a step back and kind of do a brainstorm exercise with your team around or anybody you're working with in the business to try to understand what a portfolio might look like. But then you might get to this point and say, okay, but which one do we focus on? Like, let's say we did that step back, we look at our portfolio and like, now what, right? Well, I mentioned Forrester just came out with their research around this, and Maxie Schmidt had posted this, but I loved her quote here, right? So picking the right journeys and pick the right journeys and build a killer success story, right? Pick the wrong journeys and you're going to breed stakeholder skepticism. I've seen this countless times where I mention journey maps to a client or a business that I'm working with, and they're immediately like, yeah, we've got lots of journeys. Like, no, we know what those are. Yeah. But that skepticism tells me right away that either the wrong journeys were picked or the journeys were somehow not used in the right way. And so like there's a key part here when you're picking the right journeys. You can't say, let's map the whole universe. You're going to have to say, let's map just the solar system. Let's map just with what's within our reach and not the whole universe, and not try to go too big. So how do we pick those? Well, Maxie and Forrester has recently published, if you go to that QR code, they've published a blog, and Forrester, if you have access to that, has a prioritization matrix that you can use, and it's got like 10 dimensions and things like that. That's great. I've been using my own prioritization methodology, and it's very, I'd say, very similar and aligned to what Forrester's having, but I've used the human-centered design approach. The thing about it is, if you're an HCD person, you might say, Keith, you've got these in the wrong order. You'd say, hey, why is viability first and feasibility and desirability ending? Well, when it comes to journey mapping prioritization, I always say, and whenever I've worked with a team on this, I'm always like, well, where's it impact financially? Like, where's it impact the money? So I use the HCD approach, but I do flip it a little bit and kind of start with what's the impact this journey is going to have to the business? Is it a growth opportunity? Like if a customer goes through this, is it about acquiring a customer? Is it about retaining a customer? Is it, how's that impacts that business part? Because a lot of the journeys that we need to focus on, especially in this era of making sure we have an ROI around CX, you want to make sure that your journeys are connected to business strategy and to the business outcomes. A lot of times I also like to ask the question that sometimes gets missed is, can the business afford to not prioritize this journey? Meaning, is there a risk that's happening if we don't understand this journey well? Is there a business risk that we could be avoiding or preventing? That also can calculate into your ROI of CX, right? You could say, hey, we took a proactive approach. We understood this journey and we made changes before we had this risk happen to the business. And this is how much money we avoided potentially, having hit our operations or the call center, for example. And then I already mentioned the business goals from a viability perspective. Then I look at prioritizing around feasibility, right? Do I have resources that are going to be able to help me improve the journey or make changes to this journey, right? How will it impact our employee experience? We've got to think about the overall impact and effort there. Are we looking for quick win journeys, or are we okay with going a little more complex? Sometimes, if we're just getting started, we need that quick win. And so like maybe the journey needs to be a little smaller, a little more manageable so that we can show the value of doing that work. And then does our team have the right skills and abilities? Now, UXPressia has a wonderful training guide. I've always been, throughout the years, I've always been impressed with how well the team is always trying to train you up on how to use journeys, think about journeys. And so there's a lot of resources that Veronica and others can share with you if you need more there. And I'm also going to be available to talk to as well. And then ultimately desirability, right? Like, does the customer care about this map just as much as the business, right? Does the customer get value out of it? What are they saying about that journey today? Like, can we use VOC and insights to understand a little bit more about where they're at? Are they complaining about on social media or other places? And then, will this journey be something customers tell others about? A little bit of that, is there going to be any delightful moments that this journey could really be a differentiator for the business and for the customers? So that's kind of an approach that I take to prioritizing and thinking about that. So if you go back to this, like, here's again just an example. So you might say that, okay, if we're thinking about our business strategy and that viability, feasibility, desirability, what we are hearing the most and understanding more from the business is like this. An example, this integrations would be first, organic prospecting would be the second, and then contract renewal will be the third. So we would just pick 2 or 3 journeys to really focus on and dive into as part of a roadmap of like what we're going to map first, right? And so then before we dive in, I promise I will show you a journey and we'll dive into it. And I do want a little bit of reaction there from folks because I intentionally left it undone. But before we dive into that, I do want to talk about the measurement piece and journey analytics, right? So this understanding of how customers behave, their customer behaviors impact the business outcomes, and we're measuring the key journeys, not just the individual touch points. And what do I mean by that? Well, McKinsey & Company had a great example here of how the sum of interactions does not equal how your journey is performing, right? If you read this example here, this use case, right? You've got a media company, they've got a customer onboarding experience, right? A journey that's going to last 3 months, has 9 phone calls, a visit from a technician, numerous web and email interactions. And what do you see, right? At every point along the interactions, everybody in their silo is focused on getting a good customer satisfaction score, right? They're always focused on improving their channel and really thinking about like, hey, if I look at those individual channels, we've got high ratings, call center, the the technician, the email responses, like all the surveys, all the things are coming back great. But if we do a relationship survey, we see that that end-to-end journey has a really low satisfaction rating. Well, why? Well, because the customer didn't want 9 phone calls. They didn't want multiple email and web interactions, right? Like they might have just needed the technician and maybe 1 or 2 communications, but like they didn't want all those interactions. So that's the importance of understanding why we'll measure the entire journey and why to think about journey analytics and the journey performance rather than just the channels, because the sum of those interactions don't always equal how the customer views that journey performing for them. And so this is great from Forrester. I love using this example because the 3 types of CX metrics, right? Like I use this all the time as that framework of what are my outcome metrics, what are my perception metrics, and what are my interaction metrics, right? Because the outcome is closer to that journey performance, perception, how are they feeling about it, and then what happens along the way, those interaction metrics. Those are all important, but these should be used in orchestration when we're thinking about how to measure that journey. And when we dive into the example I have today, I'll kind of show you a little bit of how we use them. Another way, I love this from the Harvard Business Review. One thing I've learned a lot is asking this question, right? As a lot of times when we're working with journeys and we're talking to our business partners about customer experience, we're really focused on the measures of how the customers are performing for the company when we're defining our metrics. It's all about, well, what's our response rate and what's our NPS and like all these things about how the customer performs for the company. And I've really been trying to shift this focus and use customer performance indicators and use this question of, well, how are we as a company performing for the customer? How would the customer measure our performance, right? And using that as another way of thinking about how to apply metrics and writing those metrics down in the journeys. So I'll show you kind of examples of that. It doesn't mean that you'll see sometimes that they overlap, but we'll talk through it a little bit more. And I definitely want to get your reaction to that. Veronica, I'll take a moment here. Are there any questions so far that I need to pause and answer right now before we go a little deeper?
As far as I can see, there are no questions, but maybe
Perfect.
someone wants to, add something.
Yeah. That's okay. I'll just make sure I'm breathing for a second. I know everybody probably wants to see the map I've talked about, so.
I believe so.
Yeah. So the, Harvard Business Review also mentions, a lot of times if we can focus those company outcomes or focus on those CPIs, a lot of times you're going to have better performance of your KPIs because it's really that customer first mindset. All right, show you a map. I promised a map. Let's get to the map. Give me a second here. So I know the map is kind of tiny. I did that on purpose to attempt to show everything here, but if it's too small, but let me, I'll zoom in here and talk a little bit about Luis Butler. So I mentioned that a journey should be about one person, one story to try to communicate clearly. So Luis is an electrician by trade, and he had, during the pandemic, had hit some hard times, had some job cuts and time off work, as a lot of people did during the pandemic. And in this particular case, he needed to take a hardship, like he hit a hardship in his career, in his life, and he needed to pay bills and keep things moving. And so here in the US, they have the ability, if you have a retirement account, you can take a loan against that retirement account and then pay that retirement loan or that loan back to help put your retirement savings back into place. Okay, now it's never recommended that you do that, but if in a hardship or in scenarios of the pandemic, the company that did the retirement loans, or loans against retirement, saw quite a few of these, as you can imagine. And so Luis found himself in a scenario where he needed to take that loan. But now he's got his tax return for this year, which has also just happened here in the US again for the season of tax returns. Well, Luis could spend that money on other things, but he also knows, and he's trying to be fiscally responsible and say, I need to save more from my retirement, and decides, hey, I'm going to try to make an extra loan payment with some of the extra money that I got from my refund. So that's the setup for this journey. And if we go through the journey, and I'll go through it high level, what we go through is, Luis, how I typically have it is very similar to what UXPressia provides as far as templates, the user goals of the process, his experience, right? In this case, Luis doesn't have a great ending in this particular case. And again, this is an example map. It's not 100% accurate. I had to change names and processes and other things to scrub it from the client. But with the user goals, he's trying to make that extra payment. So he thinks, I'll just go to the website, I'll log in, and I'll just make that extra payment, right? So he goes through, and he's anticipating that, but he goes through and starts to make these changes and logs in, and he's really trying to search for, how do I make an extra loan payment? He can see a loan payoff, he can see, taking another loan, but he's not really finding this extra loan payment, right? And so he struggles a little bit there. And he doesn't understand why he can't find that feature. So he was expecting that feature to be there. It's not there. So at first he decides to do the customer support. I'm just going to write contact us and do that. Now, I like to call out, like, there's a lot of times that there's a moment of truth here, right? Where so if you can see here, I've got the think and feel, I've got channels he's using, problems, opportunities, and then we'll get into the metric stuff a little bit later here. But I like to say that, if somebody has struggled this much on the website already, the likelihood that they reach out to contact us is probably low. And there's a likelihood that we've probably lost. There's a probability that the customer has given up at this point and just went, is going to keep the money or do something else with the money. And so there, that moment of truth is like, this is a point where we're embellishing and saying Luis might go a little bit further, and some people do this, that's why we were able to know, like, this would be the next step, but it's not the majority of people that would take this next step. Similar case. So in this case, Luis reaches out, contact us. The email he gets, the response he gets back the next day is a little confusing. He's still not sure. Again, another moment of truth. At this point, he probably is just saying, I give up. But if he pushed forward, and some people do, they call in to the contact center, and they would call in into the call center and talk to an agent. And that agent would really inform him that there's not an easy way to do this. He either has to call his HR people, or he has to send a cashier's check to the company. There's no easy way to do it. And so that at that moment, Luis takes it along, and he makes a decision that it's just too much effort. It's too hard. I'm just going to pay some bills on the side and use some of the money for entertainment, and kind of gives up. Again, you might say, Keith, he's given up long before that. And I'd say, yep, you're right. The majority would have, but we were trying to push through and say, let's push through a couple, 2 or 3 moments of truth of, there's no way that a lot of people will do this in peace, but let's try to finish the journey in some way. And so at a high level, hopefully you're looking at this journey and going, hey, that's great. Like, I mean, it's a bad thing for Luis and a bad thing for the company, but like there's lots of opportunity to improve, right? We've got lots of moments of truth. We've got lots of risks, lots of ways we could be doing things different for Luis, obviously, which just starts with maybe adding the feature to allow him to pay a loan, extra payment on his loan on the website and avoid all the other pieces that go along with it. Again, if you're thinking about your ROI, you could say, here's what some people may do, a percentage of customers do. They contact us, they call us, or maybe Luis didn't do the form, he just jumped right to the contact center. But if people are calling, you can use that and start to do that ROI. So I mentioned we would talk about metrics. Remember, I mentioned the outcome metrics, perception metrics, interaction metrics, right? I didn't put these in any particular order, but I have our business KPIs and then how is the business performing for the customer. So I like to use this approach in my journey mapping to really talk through it. So this might not happen if you're doing a journey facilitation. Sometimes people like have this great moment of aha, I know how I would measure this. And so I like to try to capture that. Sometimes we do the journey mapping exercise and we have to go back and say, how would we measure these moments along the way, right? And then we even ask things like, where would our signals be? So at Medallia, we have a framework of signals to action. Where can we listen, or where might we be monitoring or analyzing data to understand what the customer is experiencing there? I also go through and ask things like, where are we going to get this data? Where's the data located? And then how are we going to visualize this data so that more than just our team, more than an insights team sees this, right? How do we democratize the data? So I always like to think holistically about my journeys, about breaking it down as we get into measurement. So if you look at measurement opportunities, right? Obviously, during the website experience, you've got moments where Luis we could be looking for the drop-offs from the loan payment. We could look at with Medallia's tool, we have a digital experience score. We could see the struggle points, how they're behaving. And we can also just look at task completion rate. Like, are people finishing other tasks in that experience, right? Abandonment rate would be a key thing for how the company is performing for the customer. And you might say, well, Keith, we've got that, the drop off and abandonment rate. The nice thing about KPIs, business KPIs and CPIs, is they can actually coexist. Like sometimes they both apply to both things. They're measuring both how the customer is performing for the company, and it also tells the story of how the company is performing for the customer. So it's okay for those metrics to be that, but that gives you a clear idea of which are some of the key metrics you should really focus on, right? It helps you prioritize. If there's no easy way to measure abandonment rate, since it's both a KPI and a CPI, that tells me we need to focus on that, making sure that measurement is a key metric because it applies to both the KPI and CPI. Hopefully that helps you in that kind of realm of metric talk of how to prioritize things. Because a lot of times we identify in journey mapping, we'll identify metrics that aren't easy to measure today. Like, I don't know how many times I've run into this where it's like, hey, it would be great if we could know how many calls we're getting and how many people are talking about this. And if there's no easy way to get that, okay, well, that's going to be on a roadmap of how we get there. How do we get to that metric? That's part of now our strategy, right? But you've got to have other metrics along the way. So when we're journey mapping, or as I'm guiding others through journey mapping and identifying the metrics, there's no holds barred. We always are trying to say, what are metrics we'd like to have? Let's not stop ourselves to, make sure we keep our design thinking caps on, and what are the key metrics for both KPIs and CPIs? But then we have that reality check later where we say, well, do we listen there? Can we capture it? Do we know where we can get the data? Can we visualize the data? Is there any way we can even get the data out? Because sometimes we're capturing the data, but there's no easy way to actually access it. And so talking through that then helps you say, okay, what are the metrics we're actually going to be able to report on across this journey from as you're going through and mapping out these journeys. So if we're looking through here, you can see I have a bunch of different listed things, from number of calls, first call resolution, was, from a CPI, what was Luis's issue resolved? That's how Luis would be measuring the company's performance. Are they able to resolve my issue, right? And again, you might say, well, that's a KPI. It can be, but if you ask yourself a question, how's the company performing for the customer? And issue resolution is really very customer focused. And then if you go through the end, that outcome metrics, what are some key outcomes, right? Obviously, net promoter score is always a top thing, but call reduction, could we save money with call avoidance? Customer effort score applies to both. So effort score here would be something we definitely would want to measure to know if both the company and the customer is performing well in this journey. So I know this is a lot of information to take in, and it's a very, I tried to use a smaller map, but hopefully it's kind of resonating with everybody. Veronica, I'll stop here while I'm on the map and see if others have questions or comments. Point out good map, bad map.
Well, the first question here is if you could share the map. Well, I believe yes. No.
Yeah, I'll be able to export it. I won't share the actual editable map, but I can export it as an example. Yes.
I believe I saw the map in the slides, right?
Not yet, but
No?
I planned on creating a PDF separate to share out. Yes.
Okay, and then we have a couple of questions, but I believe they can be answered after all in the Q&A session.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll finish up because I like to go fast and leave room for more questions and discussion.
Okay.
So we've talked about that journey performance, and again, I'm using some of Forrester's materials to help, because it's been really sounded working for me. And I mentioned, thinking about those interactions and then those outcome, and obviously there's perception metrics in here, right? But I love this little way of saying, okay, how can we actually try to quantify or put a performance rating on our journeys? And I love this example because here's just an idea, right? This is just a notion, but I've used this, and it's really easy then to communicate, right? And I'll show you how I communicate it here in a second, but here's kind of just a way of looking at it. So if I have a bunch of interactions along my journey and I'm not seeing a lot of struggle, so I don't have any concerns, or I just have a few concerns, but yet my outcome metrics, like after a customer goes through this journey, is the business getting what they want? Is the customer getting what they want? If that's working well, usually it doesn't start that way. Usually you're working from the bottom and working up, right? But usually, so if you prioritize and you're like, okay, we're seeing 2 or 3 concerns and we're not quite at target for our outcome metrics, so it might be an adequate or just okay performing journey, right? But you might have other poor or bad journeys that you need to focus on. So if you recall, when I did the journey prioritization, I said, here are the 3 journeys we're going to focus on. But now I'm going to flip it a little bit and use the journey performance and say, after mapping out these journeys, what we discovered is that what we thought was our number 1 was a poor experience, but our number 3 and prioritization was actually the worst experience for the customers and the business, right? And so that journey performance now gives you another way of adjusting your prioritization to say, okay, as we go to take action on these things, we should probably focus on the contract renewal process, then look at integrations, or if you can do it in parallel, depending on what resources you have. But then you might actually talk to the business and say, is adequate good enough? Like sometimes our journeys, because these might be bigger efforts, is our organic prospect just going to have to be good enough and not be on our roadmap for right now? And we're only going to prioritize these two. So the beauty of this is you've got lots of ways of prioritizing what journeys to start with, right? And you could use the Forrester framework or use the inverted human-centered design framework like I use. And you can prioritize the journeys, but then you use journey performance to really say, which journeys am I going to act on next, and how that kind of shifts some of the priority of how you'll focus on it. So it's like this two frameworks together, coming together to really help you align on the best way to use your journeys. And this is the beauty is again, you're now also mapping out what metrics you're going to report on to say, okay, here's how we're moving from poor to adequate or poor to good. Hopefully you could jump straight from poor to good or excellent, right? But like, here are the metrics that we're going to be monitoring to know if we're making an impact on those journeys. And, you know, having that in your journey map is a key, it's a key thing. I see this gap a lot of times when I see those journeys and I don't see those layers of what are my KPIs, what are my CPIs, and you know, what's your scorecard? How's your journey performing? You really got to ask those questions and monitor that as part of your journey portfolio. And then I'll just briefly talk about where I work with Medallia. So we understand that this is hard. We understand that connecting all the journeys to your business is tough. We do offer not only services, we have thought leadership, other folks like myself who do journey mapping and can help you with journey mapping if you're stuck in that. If you're trying to understand how to use technology to be with UXPressia and in other technologies to listen and to monitor and measure your journeys, like to have a digital experience analytics to measure behavior instead of asking a survey all the time. You can just, how do I monitor behavior and see where people are struggling? We have technologies that can help that and help that across channel and really help simplify and help you monitor your journeys better. And if you wanted to reach out and talk with me, you can set up a 30-minute chat one-on-one. Talk to me about what problem you're trying to solve, how you're trying to use your journey, get advice if you want me to look at it. Again, Veronica and Yulia both know that I use UXPressia quite a bit, but I know that everybody has different tools to do their journey mapping. And so I'm happy to review or help talk shop with you and really make it more personal for you. So feel free to reach out and put something on my calendar if you like. And then I'll just end with this. I love this quote from Peter Drucker that, you know, quality in a service or product is not what you put into it. It is what the customer gets out of it. You know, this is where I really like to say, let's make sure we as journey mapping professionals and CX professionals are asking, how is our company performing for the customer? And, you know, what are they getting out of the journeys they're taking with us? That should be the first and foremost question we ask, and then go to the business KPIs as a second. And so, Veronica, that's what I had for today.
Thank you so much, Keith. You can just, you know, take a breath a little bit. Thank you so much for sharing and, you know, showing the map and sharing your approach. I believe now is the time for Q&A. And while you're breathing and drinking water, taking a sip of water, We will go ahead and take the time for questions. So we already have some in the chat, and I will just remind that if any one of you here have more questions, just feel free to type them in the chat. And while you're doing that or thinking about your questions, I would remind you that you can visualize your customer journeys. You can analyze and improve customer experience and do that all in UXPressia platform. So register and start exploring the features on your own or sign up for a personal demo, because our sales team is always happy to help you find the features that will help you the most. And if you want to speed up your journey mapping process, feel free, or just, I remember there were people who don't build journey maps yet. And if you want to start doing that and need some hint, feel free to check out our UXPressia templates. We got plenty of them and they're pretty helpful. So now I believe we can move to the questions. So Keith, I believe you're ready for that.
I'll do my best. Yeah.
Okay, and the first question we have, it actually came in just right before the event. So
okay.
The question is from Lou Helen. When working with a SaaS platform in B2B or B2C, what are the best ways to efficiently measure the end customer satisfaction without having direct access to them?
Okay, so not being able to access them, and sorry, you said B2B, B2C?
Mm-hmm.
So if obviously if you're not able to talk to customers, the first and foremost is always talk to leadership about trying to get access to them. Like, don't give up the fight about getting access to them. And try to make sure that you're getting access to the real customers and not the hand-picked only people who are going to say good things about you, customers. Don't give up that fight. Obviously, there's a lot of operational data that a lot of organizations are already sitting on a lot of data and information that could tell you a lot about the customers just through analyzing that information. A great example with, so I've, before I actually came to Medallia, I was a client of Medallia, and we had a lot of data around email chats and email conversations, and we were able to use Medallia to look back for 2 years around content and text analytics and surface what were key topics and themes that people were really discussing. And so while we didn't at the time, because we worked through a intermediary, like through a third party, like brokers and things, right? So they own the customer. They didn't want us talking to the customer, but we were able to look at the communications customers had with them and with the company, and really get a somewhat of an understanding of what journeys were working and what weren't, and find opportunities to look at that using some of the text analytics with Medallia.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is here from David. He actually loves the idea of CPIs. And the question is, how can I measure those without simply falling back on flawed NPS scores?
Yeah. So this probably should set up 30 minutes to even go deeper on this one. But I think framing, this is where some of the storytelling comes in. You're going to have these slides that I share with you, right? And you're going to be able to say, what are the metrics that we have around our business metrics and our customer performance indicators, right? I think really telling the story around what the scorecard should be and communicating the why this matters is a first step, right? And I know that's hard. It's a little bit of a longer process, probably not what you want to hear, but you signed up to do customer experience work. That's the challenge, right? Like it's going to be a road. But yeah, for me, really communicate, one, it's Harvard Business Review is very reputable. So you're able to reflect that it's not just Keith talking. It's coming from another institution, another research company who's given that idea, and you're trying to align across this framework. A lot of times those leaders will buy into it because it's not just a homegrown solution. It's something that we can, trend around. But it's really about the storytelling piece, like, making sure you're saying, here's how customers are experiencing us, and here's how their behaviors are impacting our business. But let's talk about how our business is impacting our customer, and have a scorecard ready for that. Is my best approach to answering that.
Thank you. And we have a question from Katie. What is the best way to communicate the difference between CPI and KPIs and interaction, perception, and outcome metrics? How can they complement each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, you do have to know your audience. Like, are they going to tolerate this? Like, if it's at an executive level, you really have to make sure that you're just you don't have to always explain the difference to some high level leaders, right? A lot of times I'm using the CPI, KPI discussion when I'm talking to business leaders, like business lines or different product type of areas, to try to get them more customer centric. When it comes to executives, I sometimes don't always make the distinguish that they're CPIs and KPIs, though in the end, with some clients I've worked with, we have started creating kind of a one-page scorecard where we have kind of KPIs and CPIs, and we've educated leadership, right, of why this matters, why it's focused, and still saying, that I think an important notation here to that complementary piece was, a lot of times with CX, we're talking a lot about sentiment and perception metrics. And while those are definitely important about how people feel about the journeys and the brand and the company, you want to tell some of that, but a lot of the CPIs are more of those kind of operational impact. There's an impact to the business if the CPIs are not doing well. And so like, that's where I kind of show that shift of outcome. It's closer to the outcome metrics and how these interactions connect to the outcome metrics. And perception is a big part of it, but like how those two are correlated helps me talk more to business audiences, right? If we're just talking about vision and inspiration, then the perception metrics really come into play too.
Thank you. The next question here is from Adam. Many journeys involve looping or nonlinear actions. How do you represent those? Should they be measured in different ways, especially loops? Do things measure differently with each subsequent loop?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard to say without having like the use case in front of me. But yeah, if there's a lot of cyclical action happening, depending on how that journey goes, like sometimes those journeys break off and they go into their own type of loop. But yeah, sometimes there's a comeback and go there. A lot of times when that's occurring, I do try to have kind of a subset of CPIs and KPIs to measure kind of the effectiveness of that loop. But then in the end, I'm still looking at the overall journey performance, right? How to visually represent that. UXPressia has good, with the process tool, you can actually do linear, nonlinear, and kind of loop pieces of it. And then a lot of times, like even if there's a split in the map, like let's say here's a fork in the road, and you're like, well, what happens if somebody does this loop instead of that loop? Well, first of all, I use data to say, well, what's the majority of, like I use kind of that 80-20 rule. What are the majority of the customers of the data we have? What a majority of customers, which journey do they follow, right? Because you can go down this rabbit hole of creating more and more sub journeys. but what's the data telling us? What's the majority of people doing? How are they behaving and what are they going through? And I try to stick to that as my one map, even though I know there might be 10% or, edge cases where some customers might do this, some customers might do that. Okay, edge cases can't be represented always in a journey. You're really trying to tell the story of the biggest volume of customers impacted. So keeping it back to that, my one persona, one journey, that one persona represents my key customer the company is targeting, those types of folks. And they represent 80% of how people behave, which is why when you're doing the journey map, having the customer research and understanding your business segmentation and understanding those pieces of it goes into the mapping exercise so that you don't, you're trying not to do those splits. Otherwise, with UXPressia, when I've had those, I need to show a split, I actually create a second map and just have a link and say, kind of, here's like a fork in the road, and I can embed the links and kind of jump to the other map if needed.
Thank you so much, Kit. We have a question from Laura, and actually I was thinking about the same thing.
Okay.
How would you suggest to introduce the CPI idea within a company without scaring people for the additional metrics?
So what I tell, this is where hopefully you saw in the example, there aren't additional metrics really, right? It's more of a mindset a little bit. So it doesn't have to be additional metrics. It just has to be about that, asking ourselves that question to see if there is a metric that we may have missed monitoring or understanding that could be really key to helping us understand the customer's perspective instead of always just the business perspective. So whenever I've brought that up, I know new concepts can be scary at certain conservative companies. And so whenever I brought this up, I usually say, this is just really about asking, first of all, the question, do we have any metrics that really say how we as a company perform for the customer? And sometimes we do already. Sometimes customer effort already exists. Well, hey, there's one that we know is typically across both of those types of metrics, right? But a lot of times things like, like we'll do average handle time in the call center. You might do average handle time, right? But you're not actually looking at how long was actually somebody on the call for the whole time, right? Like some people only get obsessed about the AHT, the average handle time, and they're not really paying attention to how many transfers or how many, like the length of time somebody had to take from the customer perspective. So sometimes it's just about time, and it's about saying, can we measure both? Can we really understand both and not just say that the business is doing well because the AHT is low, because even if that's low, it doesn't mean that the customer wasn't waiting for 20 minutes. Again, it's about looking at that whole journey performance rather than just the interaction, right? And so a lot of times it's about having that conversation and trying to explain of, hey, these are other metrics we might want to measure. And I'll be honest, a lot of times when I introduce this, new metrics come up and we say, we're going to work towards getting to a point where we can measure these more effectively. If we're not measuring them today, it goes on our roadmap of things we want to measure more effectively as part of our strategic roadmap in CX. Hopefully that helps to answer her question.
Thank you. Well, I believe yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a next question from Karina. Do you have any recommendations for utilizing journey metrics to contribute to compliance requirements?
Ooh, that one's a good one. I'm gonna have to think about that one. Kind of depends on which, like my head goes, because I've worked in so many different industries, compliance requirements it's a big, broad subject. So I would love to have a conversation one-on-one about that one. I don't know if I can come up with that without hearing some of the compliance regulations that that we need to connect to. But yes, like sometimes, I mean, typically regulatory, like I've worked in highly regulated industries, and um, a lot of times those regulatory metrics are things that are kind of just, obligatory. They're typically more in the KPI space than they are in the CPI space, though you could argue some of them might be CPI related. But yeah, might have to do a follow-up on that one, Veronica.
Karina typed in the chat that ADA compliance could be a practical example, perhaps.
Perfect. Okay, good. Yeah, so like ADA, yeah, like if you that would definitely be some like a CPI that you could use, and talk about how we're performing that way. ADA, and from a journey map perspective, a lot of times the kind of data there, it's a little bit harder to get. You might have to do more user testing and more kind of field research to get some of that, um, you know, information about, not only from a visual impairment type of approach, but also like button size and other kind of feature size things, because some people can't hold a mouse or can't use a mouse and things like that, and kind of understanding that experience. You could definitely get into key metrics there. I'm just trying to think about like, um, it might be aligned more to the journey of like, what are the tasks they're trying to complete online, and then where are they struggling, and looking at some of the, like with Medallia, we have that digital struggle piece. So if we see people having a hard time trying to click on things, or trying to navigate to things, it can alert us to that.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And I know that the time is almost up here,
Oh, yes.
but we have like 3 questions. Are you okay to take a
I
couple
can
of
stay a
more?
little longer. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So just 3 questions, probably.
Okay.
So here's the question from Sabrina. What's the best way of picking the right journey? I assume it's not run all analysis of all journeys and find the most troublesome one, right?
Right. Yeah, no. So when I was talking about that journey portfolio, I'm not talking about doing journey mapping for every one of those, right? The idea is to kind of brainstorm, well, what are the all possible journeys across our customer lifecycle, and then narrow down, picking the right one. And this is where I use that kind of the human-centered design approach, right? But I start typically with, well, what are my business strategies? Like, I talk to my business partners, I talk to key stakeholders. What are the things they're trying to accomplish? I've worked with some companies where, they're wanting to roll out a new online product, or a new product and service, and they want that all to be online. And you know the key there is they want to understand. So it's like, okay, well, what's the online experience today? They're going to be making changes, but they have no way of understanding of really what's happening today. That's a perfect use case for a customer journey, right? To say, well, let's understand the current state, and let's understand and then as we work through that, we're going to have base metrics that we can use to say, as we change to a feature state and map what that new feature state is going to look like, we can now use those key metrics to say, okay, are we impacting the KPIs? Are we impacting the CPIs? And then the outcome metrics? Are we getting the results we're expecting? So that's kind of the approach I would take. But like, from that prioritization, it's really about first starting with understanding that business need, right? So in that example, it's like that's a good journey to start with, because you know that the business is interested in understanding, and that's where I try to go start first.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And a question from Sarah. What are your thoughts on documenting the journey map at an ideal desired design versus the current state, as you showed? Is there ever any value in documenting the journey map to be design agnostic?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of times I like to use UXPressia's tool to have, I'll do like I'll create a second kind of line, and sometimes I add a few rows to kind of say, here's where I want desired state to be. So I might have a second emotion line to say, here's the gap we want to have, and here it's set like, so things I'll put in there are, I'll put in a secondary line on the emotion and say, if it's really low, I want to try to get them to either neutral. You know, it depends on what we're capable of doing, right? So we kind of assess what resources we have, what are we going to be able to change, and then as we do that feature state, we set goals. So we kind of use that. I would use that the OKR approach, objective key results. Like what's the emotion? What's the perception we want people to have? What is the process we want to change? And then also put in there, what do we want people to say? It's a key piece, because if you're listening if you're using surveys to listen, sometimes they're going to say nothing at all. So what we're going to but what if they say anything? What do we want them to say about that experience, right? Like, let's define a future quote. And then also look for, are we hearing less of what we in the current state we're hearing, you know, where they were complaining about this feature or this service? Like, are we hearing less of that? And are we hearing any of the recognition of like, oh, hey, this was better than I thought, or easier than I thought, those types of things. So we kind of do that future mapping, but I am a big fan of that for creating the strategy and using that as a roadmap and saying, okay, how close are we to hitting where we future mapped, and using the metrics there.
Thank you so much. And yes, I believe that will be the last question for today. I don't see any more in the chat as of now. So the question is from Sandy. How important is empathy mapping in persona and journey mapping process?
Yeah. So I didn't cover it in this topic today because it's so big, but every journey mapping workshop I have ever run, either virtually or not, I always start with empathy mapping. And I really do it for two reasons, because you could say that the empathy map we do is kind of a, you're like, well, we already mapped the journey there. And actually, I use empathy mapping to warm people up to getting people to the empathy before we actually start doing the actual journey, so that they don't go straight into business process mapping. I use the empathy map to warm them up and question, you know, and get people more to focus on the persona and the empathy there as a warm-up exercise, essentially, to then going to the journey map. Because then in the journey map, if they start using things like, well, then people do this or people do that. No, what did Luis do? It's Luis's journey, not what people do. It's Luis, you know, you can always go back to your empathy and your exercise around your persona. So it makes that conversation a little easier when you're a facilitator. Hopefully that helps answer that question, but it's a fun facilitator technique.
Thank you so much, Keith. And well, that was the last question for today. You can breathe out and kind of relax. Thank you so much for sharing once again your approach, for sharing your ideas and answering so many questions.
If you want to see more events like this, make sure to check the upcoming ones at UXPressia.eventbrite.com or check the recordings we've got on this channel. Take care, and I will see you around.